I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by Megan Hurst and Christine Madsen, who are talking about a topic that is quite dear to my heart. Technology is not the answer. So, and why that might be, they will enlighten us as they go through their conversation and talk. But Megan Hurst and Christina, co-founders of Athenaeum21 Consulting, and it's really great to have them with their wide range of experience talk about this particular topic today. They've worked with both higher education, arts, cultural heritage, and also publishing and media organizations worldwide. So everyone from Harvard University and Oxford through to a whole range of different cultural heritage organizations, the British Library included. So they have a really great insight from our perspective as to how do we get digital embedded within our organizations, and what do we need to think about when we're trying to get that digital strategy accepted and adopted. They, between them, have over 55 years of experience. So I think we will learn a lot today from their perspectives, covering both North America and the United Kingdom, and I suspect even touching into Europe. So I'm absolutely delighted to be able to hand over to Megan Hurst and Christine Madsen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. Let me just pull up some slides. So thank you for having us today. We're really, really happy to be here. As Kirsty said, we'd like to just have a conversation today really about digital strategy, and some of that is going to be facilitated by Kirsty, but we're also hoping to have a conversation with all of you. We just thought we'd start today by setting the stage a little bit, talking about some work that we have done, some research, particularly about digital strategy, that's really shaped our thinking over the last couple of years. So we're just going to talk, I'm going to talk about kind of the origins of that research, and then Megan's going to run through some of the findings, and then we can dive into the conversation. So first, we thought it would be important to actually define what we mean by digital strategy to make sure we're all sort of on the same page. We defined a digital strategy as a plan of action for the adoption of institutional processes and practices that transform the organization and culture to effectively and competitively function in an increasingly digital world. And we took great pains really in some ways to write that definition without talking about technology. And we think it's really important in defining and understanding a digital strategy to separate it from an IT strategy or a technology plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, and possibly even in the conversation piece. So a little bit of history. In 2018, Athenaeum21 was commissioned to conduct an environmental scan to find out how and why some digital strategies are successful and why others are not. Why do some fail? So in order to conduct that research, we looked across higher education, nonprofits, some governmental organizations, a few businesses, really kind of large, complex organizations, often organizations with legacy technologies and systems and a lot of technical debt. We did a literature review, we did a web review, and we had these really great conversations with some of the leaders from these organizations who were really transforming the organizations. And so that really helped us understand what the characteristics of successful digital transformation are. So we summarized that in a report, but then last year, we decided to kind of rewrite the findings, re-summarize the findings, and published our book, Technology is Not the Answer. So a bit about what we found. Oftentimes when you ask somebody what a digital strategy is or what it's comprised of, this is kind of what it ends up looking like. Technology heavy, and maybe a bit of data increasingly over the last few years. But it's really, those two things are really just the tip of the iceberg, or the pyramid, if you will. One of the people that we had the great fortune of speaking with when we did this research was Gerald Kane, who's a researcher at MIT at the Sloan Business School. And he summarized it really elegantly this way. He studies digital transformation in businesses mostly, being in business school. So he said how an organization implements technology is only a small part of digital transformation. In cases where digital transformation does involve implementing new technologies, the technology is only part of the story. So now I'm going to hand over to Megan, and she's going to talk about very briefly what the other parts of that story are.
Great. So thank you, Christine, and welcome everybody. Really happy to be here with you. So in fact, we found that foundational to that tip of the pyramid that Christine just referenced are 4 other things. So there's people, culture, leadership, and organizational alignment. Successful digital strategies attend to these elements well before selecting and implementing any technical solutions to digital objectives. While we acknowledge that data is part of the more visible tip of the pyramid, as you saw in the slide that Christine presented, it is more often than not neglected as an integral part of digital strategy. And we're happy to discuss that a bit later, if you like. Finally, technology. Many, if not most, organizations and leaders want to jump to the most visible solutions. And in our moment in history, this most often takes the form of information systems and software. However, our research revealed that the most successful digital strategies are those that are designed first and foremost with people and culture in mind. Leadership and organizational alignment, then that middle layer, act as the bridge from the foundational layer of people and culture to the most visible layer of data and technology. Only when people, culture, leadership, and organizational alignment are in place can the data and technology elements of digital strategy really fully succeed. After identifying these trends across the organizations we researched, we also recognized the same patterns in our own experiences and observations with clients, both prior and since. Next slide. Great. So for each of these 6 areas, the book outlines 3 to 6 key findings or recommendations for success, which you see here. To successfully develop and implement a digital strategy, your organization's practices, policies, attitudes, and incentive structures need to reinforce it rather than work against it. We don't really have enough time to go into each of the findings and recommendations, but I will highlight just a few of them here. So if we look at people, the element of being agile and adaptive, for instance, as an example, developing or even hiring for these soft skills is important to supporting change and evolution during digital transformation. If we take culture, one of my favorites is expect a marathon, not a sprint, but celebrate the sprints. This really means that framing goals in realistic timeframes and acknowledging incremental success goes a long way towards maintaining momentum, especially when change is challenging, which I think we all know it very often is. For leadership, establish a common language. That is different perspectives and language, often with people using the same terminology to mean different things, is a common obstacle to success in the organizations we've worked with. Taking the time to define terms, or even the corpus of technologies being managed under a digital strategy, really helps everyone move faster and more efficiently in the long run. If we look at organizational alignment, align funding and resource allocation with your digital objectives. This one seems obvious, but in many organizations, it can require conscious discussions and decisions to change status quo financial approval processes, for instance. Well, I will leave off here with just these 4 brief examples. We're happy to hear your questions or experiences with these or any of the other recommendations on this slide. We can keep this slide up for reference during our discussion. And I believe there's also a link that has been shared to a digital copy of the book, if anybody wants to download it for reference during the discussion or for your enjoyment afterwards. So with that, I will turn it over to Kirsty Linkstadt to lead our discussion.
Well, thanks just for that kind of brief overview, and having had a wee look and also having been involved in quite a few things that have failed, I was particularly curious around about why in particular do digital strategies fail? And you sort of started touching on some of the elements that we really need, but I just wondered if you could, both from your experience and the conversations you've had, could just share a little bit more with us around about why does a digital strategy not succeed, and why does it not really deliver what sometimes people hope it's going to do?
Yeah. Do you want me to start, Megan?
Sure.
Yeah. I think on the surface, it would be easy for us to say, well, it fails because people don't do these, other 4 things that we've outlined below data and technology. But in a slightly more sort of nuanced way, some of what we saw was what I alluded to earlier, which is that people often kind of confuse digital strategy, which is really a culture change strategy, with an IT strategy or a technology strategy or a technology plan, or you end up with a kind of strange hybrid of the two. And if you just try the technology, and if you're just trying to roll out new digital services and things without all of this, without really that kind of foundational culture change, that's one of the biggest reasons we've seen, is just kind of a misunderstanding of what digital strategy is. A second point, and then I'll hand it over to Megan, I think, is that oftentimes leaders can try and jump in and see an obvious, this is what makes good leadership, is you see the places that need to change. You get into a new organization, you think, oh, it's clear what needs to be done, but every organization has its own kind of character and personality. And one of the things that we found was it's really important to take the time to get to know an organization before implementing a new strategy and trying to make any change. So getting to know how the organization works, where change is going to maybe be easy, where it's not. So those are a couple of the reasons. Megan, do you want to add anything else?
I can just maybe reiterate your points about taking the time. So I think patience is a really important aspect to success. And in our fast-paced, technology-driven culture where technologies are changing all the time and we're all just moving faster and faster, it's difficult sometimes to put the brakes on and take the time, be patient enough to really, as Christine said, look at the culture and look at what the culture can tolerate, or take the time to bring people along in the process of transformation. There's also the tendency to jump to solutions, to jump very quickly to, just tell me what I can buy now that will either stop pain if there's pain, or create something new that's innovative and demonstrates our innovation. So just being very deliberate and not being afraid of things taking a little bit longer is important. One CIO that we've worked with at one of our clients' organizations, he said to us at one point, I think he said he came into a very complex organization with a lot of legacy systems, a lot of redundancy, and he came in knowing that it was going to take him at least 3 years to even accomplish some very basic things, like, for instance, consolidating email services across the university. And that didn't bother him. He was willing to do, to take that time to make sure that everybody was going in the same direction and felt fully bought in to the changes that were being made. And then that really helped him build the foundation for larger projects in the long run. So.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I think as you were sort of talking there, I was really conscious that even developing the digital strategy actually is not something that can be done in a hurry, but actually needs a bit of thought and time before you kind of get to that kind of right strategy for your organization in order to be able to take it forward. So we've got some great questions beginning to come in. So I'm just going to sort of pick up on a couple of those, and a couple of those are also around about that sort of failure and where things haven't worked. So picking up on that theme from Chris All, if a digital strategy has not initially worked, but technology change has taken place, what works to bring the digital strategy back on track?
Oh, that's a good question.
Depends on why it didn't work. Do you have a specific example in mind of kind of it not working and why? Or
so Chris, do you want to elucidate on that a little further to put you on the spot?
Yeah. Well, Chris is deciding. We can also say, I think some of it goes back to that patience, and you know, Megan alluded to sort of expecting a marathon but celebrating the sprint, and understanding that it's a long-term thing, as you said, Kirsty. Even just, even just writing a digital strategy or crafting a digital strategy is a fairly long-term thing. So, having that long-term vision in place, you know, that marathon, and understanding that you might get knocked off, you know, you're going to have bad miles and good miles.
So
Here's
Chris is going to join us. So Chris, would you like to ask the questions?
It's a great question.
It was almost easier than trying to find the right place to type it, actually. Talking of technology and digital experience. No, I suppose the scenario I was thinking about is just where, for example, there was a desire to bring about change in terms of getting people more engaged in the use of technology, use of digital. And we've had experiences, which I think one of you alluded to, where the driver for that was, let's put in a new system. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't without some sense of digital strategy about where we wanted to go with it.
Yeah.
And so there was that thinking in place. But it was sort of driven by the technology rather than driven by the other elements that you've highlighted.
Yeah.
And hence the technology change has taken place. Mm-hmm. People have generally sort of stumbled along with it. Mm-hmm. And now it's one of those scenarios where recognizing that when you're introducing a digital strategy, you're never starting with a blank sheet of paper. It's always a sort of where you are now, but having to sort of think, okay, well, if we want to sort of, in a sense, re-energize the digital strategy and get people back on board with it, what particularly works in the context of knowing that the technology change hasn't necessarily worked as well as you might have hoped it would.
Yeah.
Christine, do you mind if I jump in?
No,
first?
go for it.
So the title of our book is deliberately provocative, and we're not saying that technology is not important, of course. And you know, we actually consider ourselves technologists. However, putting humans at the center first, whether it's your staff or your users, and sometimes those are the same, is really important. So understanding what needs to be accomplished with the technology is really, I think, the linchpin to bringing people along. So having everybody on the same page about, you know, what are we trying to accomplish here before we get into systems and software? What is the objective? And how, and then coming up with representative personas, use cases, to really center. And this is part of establishing a common language, is having everybody on the same page about who this technology is for and what they need to accomplish with the technology. And then from there, you can go into use cases and prioritizing those things. So use cases are really helpful for conversations around priority. And that's, whether you're purchasing a software solution or building something, having those elements in place really helps to have difficult conversations sometimes around priority, and even sometimes it comes down to budget and time, the constraints that come with that.
Yeah, I think just to kind of come at what Megan was saying from a slightly different angle, I think vision is really important, and having everybody focused on a clear goal and a clear vision. It's why we kind of made the moonshot reference in our book and used that as the kind of the launching point to, for a bad pun, because it's knowing that you're working towards this end goal and keeping people centered towards that goal or focused on that goal helps when in the scenario that you've outlined where you're getting kind of knocked off course a little bit, like, okay, let's take a step back, and this maybe didn't go as well as it could, and we've tried to do this change thing and it kind of didn't work, or it only partially worked. So let's take a step back and remember why we're doing this, and focus on that vision, and to kind of recenter everybody on that ultimate aim, I think is really important, because it gives people the not just how are we doing this, but the why. And also to the other point that Megan said, that around kind of users and user persona, the one thing that we found that can bring organizations together is focusing not necessarily on, or fairly, I would say consistently bring all sorts of organizations together, is to get them focused on sort of outside of themselves. Why are you here? You're not all just here to kind of help each other, and that's great. And you're not here just to perpetuate the organization. You're here because people are relying on you and people need you, and you're doing, you're of service, or, if it's a business, you're providing products or services. So focusing the organization as part of that vision on not just, here's what we're trying to accomplish long term, but why and for whom, getting the human element back into it, can help people refocus after a kind of stumble like that, I think.
That's great. And thanks very much for that, Chris,
Thank you.
and for joining us on the
Chris.
panel. Hopefully we'll see a few other people join us a bit later as well. So I think that also touches what you were saying, Christine, there a bit on one of the other questions we've had, which is, how do you go about reframing that kind of conversation when it's kind of very much landed on, say, technology and platforms, that kind of nice, shiny new stuff, and to kind of particularly focus on the kind of people, the kind of capability and capacity building? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I think it is stepping back and recentering on that question of not just what, but why. Why are we doing this, and to what end, and to what purpose, and for whom? To really come back to the people, and will, I think, help people separate it a little bit from the technology and the systems. And I think that's really the most important thing, is to keep people at the center of it.
And so thinking around about the sort of people, we've got a few questions coming through around about, are there any kind of major differences between different types of organisations that you've worked with, say cultural heritage to higher education, and sort of thinking very much about that sort of people piece. Does that, the type of institution, does it bring huge differences to how you go about this, or are there actually more commonalities?
There are commonalities. I would say that there are distinctions that we have witnessed as well.
So what are those distinctions?
So I would say that the types of people or personalities that are attracted to different types of organizations kind of is responsible for those distinctions that we see. And then types of personalities, of course, over time can influence cultures and the cultures that those organizations develop. So, I do not want to make any stereotypes about different types of organizations. So I will.
It's going to be really hard to answer this without stereotypes, but we're going to do our best.
Let's say that change, embrace of change. So the one of the first key points that I shared on the last slide was about be agile and adaptive. You will find a higher concentration of agile and adaptive people in a business context than you will in a cultural heritage institution, for instance. And that's not to say that that isn't changing or fluid. I think we're seeing more and more agility and adaptiveness in cultural heritage and educational institutions than previously. But those personalities and cultures deeply influence, what you can accomplish and how quickly. So yeah,
and I think there are even some differences within sort of broadly within cultural heritage between libraries and museums, for example, and museums of different scales. And the organizations, as Megan said, the people in the organizations have personalities, but then the organizations themselves can often have personalities. And some of it depends on how long the organization has been around. There can tend to be in any organization, well, we've been doing it this way for 150 years. Why should we change now kind of attitude? Or we've been doing it this way for 400 years, or depending on the organization.
Right.
And I think,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
You go ahead, and then I'll jump in after.
Okay. I think that also that in some ways the physical spaces, and this is often kind of overlooked, the physical spaces that the organizations inhabit can have an impact on the culture. And some of that can be how sort of physically welcoming are they to people? Like how easy is it to get in? How easy is it for visitors to come in or users, and that all of that can have an impact on the culture. Go ahead, Megan. You were going to say.
I was also just going to say that culture is not monolithic within an organization. Depending on the organization, we've seen some where there are, very distinct and very different microcultures, if you will, within the same organization that have developed because of people's personalities or sort of department heads, management styles. If those influences are not sort of consciously managed in the organization, they will develop themselves. So that can also be a big challenge to digital transformation and success of digital strategies is actually those cultural differences. And again, that comes back to establish a common language so that in between those microcultures, you can actually have successful communication to be moving in the same direction.
Yeah. Actually, that's one of the sort of questions that's sort of bubbling around here. That recognition that participating in this digital transformation is a cultural change that everyone needs to engage in. But do you have any sort of practical advice for how you can sort of help that culture change, especially if it's perhaps a sort of microculture within the organization? Any top tips that you would recommend?
Inventory.
Yeah. Inventories.
Christine, I don't know if you agree, but it seems like
a good inventory. Yeah.
I do love a good inventory because it goes back to that establishing a common language. So if inventories help with prioritization conversations. They help with, kind of everybody being, as I said, with communication. But it also kind of, it gives people a real sense of, I don't know, a corpus or shape and scope of what they have to work with.
Yeah. And we don't mean just systems inventories or inventories of technology. We also mean service inventories. So we've worked with clients around, we're working on digital transformation, but we created a service inventory for the entire library. So, we worked with all the departments and said, what do you do? Let's make a list of everything that the libraries do. Yeah. And that kind of put everybody on it made everything, it makes a lot of the kind of tacit understanding really explicit, and gets everybody onto the same page and say, okay, now we have this canvas of things we can work with.
It also helps with conversations around limitation of resources. So, if we are having a, hiring freeze, but we want to do innovative things, how can we do that with what we have? And those inventories actually are really helpful to those conversations about, well, really, this particular service, only a small number of users are using it, but it, takes up a significant amount of time. So things like that can be helpful as well.
No, and that's interesting because, again, there's a question here around about how do you align the strategy with resourcing and how can you sort of bring that great alignment. So that's one example, but can you perhaps touch on a couple of other elements around about that kind of, how do we get the resourcing right in order to make sure we can align and deliver the strategy?
Yeah, aligning the resources is difficult, and in part, and at the risk of stereotyping libraries, which I'm about to do, libraries in particular never stop doing anything. So that makes it really, really hard. So if you can't, part of that alignment has to be having tough kind of trade-off conversations and saying, we just can't keep doing this. And to let go of certain things to free up the resources and align them towards what you want to do. Because not just from a kind of resource perspective, but I think from a cultural and even kind of an emotional and psychological perspective, people can get really excited about a new digital strategy. People can get excited about wanting to do new things. But at the end of the day, you go back to your desk and you sit down and you think, but I already had a full-time job. How am I going to do this new thing? So aligning the resources is financial resources, but it's also the kind of aligning everybody's kind of emotional bandwidths in some ways, and emotional and everybody's resources, which I think particularly over the last couple of years we've all recognized where the edges of our kind of capacity is.
Now, I think I'm kind of smiling because I do very much recognize that kind of conversation and that, sense we get very excited about something, but then actually that recognition that you do actually have to, there is a trade-off. You can't just keep adding. And I think for a long time, organizations had a bit more flexible capacity, and we've reached that point now where actually, through various different things that have happened, we no longer have spare capacity, and you are into those much tougher conversations of, well, we have to stop doing something in order to sort of take on board something new. And I suppose that's an interesting one as well, where that kind of leadership question comes in as well. And that recognition that you need to align, make those tough decisions. But what if you're also grappling with senior management who are perhaps not as digitally literate and therefore think the shiny new thing will deliver and we can also keep doing everything, or don't recognize some of the sort of staff changes and additional capabilities that we'll need to develop? How do you sort of tackle that one? That's a question from Sean Shaw that's come through.
I think that's that question is that is a larger than digital strategy question.
Any hints or pointers there to help?
That is the sort of the classic management question of managing up, right? Sort of managing your manager. And Christine's way better at that than I am. So
neatly passed over.
I think in some ways it goes back to focusing on those conversations around the why and the how. So when somebody's really focused on, we need this technology, or we need this piece of infrastructure, this platform, the first thing that we'll do is say, what will that, why, and what will that solve? What is the problem that is aiming to solve? And to really try and focus again on those like specific use cases, sort of putting leadership or putting anybody in the shoes of a particular sort of real or fictional user, and saying, okay, imagine you are, a postdoc or an undergraduate student, or an independent researcher, and let's walk through this scenario. Let's put ourselves in someone else's shoes and imagine what are the obstacles that they are encountering.
And I think it depends on the manager and what their priorities are, but really understanding your manager's motivations, right? So if they're motivated by the larger organization's mission, understanding that. If they're motivated by donors, for instance, and sort of possibilities of donor funding, you can find those as entry points to the conversations around kind of where those intersect with the digital strategy and what you're trying to accomplish.
And I think, go ahead, Christine.
No, you first.
I was just going to say, in terms of encountering people at different places in the organization that have different sets of skills. So, leadership that may not be technologically savvy. I think a recognition and understanding that you don't, in some ways, you don't have to necessarily be technologically savvy, but you have to be able to delegate that knowledge to someone who is, right? I mean, a good leader doesn't have to know everything and be able to do everybody's job, but they have to be able to hire people who are better than they are in those areas and trust them. And so kind of shifting that conversation a little bit to say, okay, well, we know this person isn't the most technologically savvy, but can we have a conversation with them about kind of balancing with somebody who is or has a different perspective. So, and that's, again, not necessarily just a digital thing, but, how do you as a leader fill in the organization for what may not be your strengths or your strong points? Megan, did you just jump in?
One other thing to add to that is it always helps to arm yourself with data, but not to drown the person that you're trying to influence with the data.
Yeah.
Okay. So that brings me neatly to one of the questions that was asked by Wanda Keenan, which is, what are the metrics being used to measure technical and service development progress and optimization? Looking at user engagement progress and optimization again, is that critical for success? So if you maybe could unpick some of that. So what metrics would you use around about this? And again, you mentioned the sort of service catalog and the measures. So what would you focus on?
Yeah. Can you just repeat that 1 second?
Sure. So,
Christy, so metrics being used for
what are the metrics being used to measure technical and service development progress and optimization, as well as user engagement progress?
Yeah. There's infinite, and it depends on the organization really, and the technologies, the services and technologies that you're doing. So it would be helpful to have a more specific example. We could talk through, what are the things that would be most meaningful to the organization.
So sorry, Christine.
I was just going to say, of those things, my instinct would be to preference the sort of metrics around the service rather than this metrics around the technological. So that to say that, is this service, are we doing better at delivering this service? Are, users more satisfied? Are there, more users? Yeah. Then kind of secondarily look at the technological kinds of metrics. But I interrupted you, Kirsty. Did you want to add?
No, I was going to kind of echo something similar. It is really kind of coming back to that question around about the user and what is the user hoping to gain from it, and trying to look at how you can measure that. But that is quite challenging in some cases. I suppose what's interesting is our questions are very much coming around the people thing. So you're absolutely right. Digital is not about the technology. But from Abigail Potter, we've got a good question round about, do you have recommendations for enabling cross-functional work across departments, especially when there is skepticism of lack of time and resources to focus on new strategies? So again, that, how do we in our institutions work across departments to try and deliver this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, I think. And again, it's the ease of that is going to depend a lot on the existing culture of the organization, and whether it's a slightly sort of matrixed organization and you're used to those sorts of cross-functional teams. One of the first ways we've tried and seen work fairly well is to orient groups and cross-functional teams around something very specific. So something very task-oriented or problem-based, to get them used to working together. So making the task kind of narrow enough that people can really get their teeth into it, get used to working together and cross-functionally, and to see, also to enable them to see progress. The things that I think inhibit cross-functional working oftentimes are the kinds of silly administrative things, like if you have a cross-functional team and something needs to be purchased, does who on the team has the budget, or whose budget is it going to come out of, or those silly little things that can make it so kind of ridiculously difficult to get a piece of software. Or so one of the keys of, I think, enabling cross-functional teams is to really make sure that if you're giving that team the responsibility for something, you have to give them the authority and you have to give them the tools they need to do it. So, you need to be able to set, we looked at one of the case studies we looked at, they set a kind of blanket, like a budget that said anything under X, if you need to buy it, you can just buy it. You don't even have to worry about it. So making sure that the teams have the power that they need, that they're fully empowered to get that work done, I think is really important, because that just, all that stuff can end up kind of getting in the way.
And there's also, it doesn't apply to every situation, but there, in the research that we did, some organizations found it really valuable to co-locate cross-functional teams in their workspaces, or to do things like have sort of flexible workspaces where people could kind of be in proximity, physical proximity to each other. Of course, now we're in a pandemic, so everything is completely different, but
do it digitally and in different ways. So just curious, because again, we've been talking about digital strategies a lot. And of course, a lot of institutions, libraries and cultural heritage organizations are involved in digitizing their collections. And we've got a kind of question here around about, can digitization benefit the digital strategy? How can that assist or help with it? Have you come across any examples of that?
I think it can, if it's, again, there's the question of why are you digitizing something, and what are you digitizing it for, and for whom are you doing it? Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things it can do is kind of excite and empower people to be able to see the results, because it's kind of, it can be one of the kind of shiny things that everybody likes to see. You know, if you've got some great collection, to make it available. But it has to, in some ways, be done with that kind of conscientiousness of, we're doing this for this particular audience. This is what, you know, this is how we're going to connect with this audience. Because oftentimes still people tend to just sort of just digitize and put stuff out there and expect people are going to find it. So, you know, that sort of outreach piece is still really, really vital. So I think it can be, but it, you know, it has to be done sort of selectively, and it is not a magic bullet.
No. And I was going to say, I've got another question here, which is going back to that sort of people piece, which I thought would be really interesting just to get your reflections on. And it's about whether you've encountered any outstanding carrot versus stick examples of how the end users and the wider culture have been encouraged or rewarded with respect to adopting that incremental kind of cultural approach that you sort of were talking about. So those kind of mini sprints you were talking about to kind of get to that end marathon goal. Any really good examples you've seen there, how teams have responded to that?
That's a good question. I think that there's in the original research we did, acknowledge, so that whole thing of celebrate the sprints is really about acknowledgement. You know, even for the little wins, and that kind of visibility and kind of shot in the arm of kind of public awareness of you know, sort of effort and moving things forward is it certainly doesn't hurt, I will say.
Yeah, and I think one of the best carrots you can offer in some ways is funding and resources. So if somebody has a new idea, for example, that aligns with, even if it's not the digital strategy, if it's just the sort of overall strategy or strategic goals of the organization, we have seen a couple of organizations that have done you know, a great job at just saying, if you have an idea that aligns with our organization, we will, you know, or our organizational strategy, you know, tell us what it is, tell us how it aligns, and we can find some resources to make it happen. So that in some ways is the best kind of carrot, to just offer people the resources that they need to get a project done, or, you know, a new service organized. And there's a couple of organizations we've seen that have done that really well.
This is somewhat tangential, but I think it's probably worth mentioning, maybe in sort of a broader context. But one thing that we've observed repeatedly is this cultural kind of divide between what I call the sort of cool kids club and everybody else in the organization that doesn't get to work on the, you know, the new and innovative projects, and is keeping, you know, working on things to keep the lights on, if you will. And I think being conscious about those divides where they exist, and really kind of working to highlight the work that happens with keeping the lights on, and then also to create sort of those smaller avenues for collaboration or opportunity for those that keep the lights on, to be involved in things that are kind of forward looking, even if maybe personality wise they're not inclined to go in that direction, but to create the pathways and opportunities and acknowledgements kind of when they do.
No, and I think that's a really important point, that, you know, while, you know, the digital strategy quite often does lead to significant change, we are also still doing some kind of key things that we have always done that need to continue, and how you balance that and also get the narrative right between those two elements, I think it's a really good reminder, and something that I'm always very conscious of. And we sometimes can get so excited about where we might be able to go that we forget that we've also still got to deliver certain things, and that sometimes people can feel underappreciated when we don't talk and acknowledge those elements as well. So no, that's yeah, Very salient. I think one of the other things that's cropped up is someone was asking around about what form does the digital strategy actually take once it's kind of finished, and I thought that was quite an interesting one. You know, is it always a document with some sort of recommendations and a roadmap? What form can it take? What have you seen in your time?
Multiple forms, and it does really depend on the organization, I think, but we've seen some organizations have very sort of flexible and brief digital strategies that are built to be revisited in a very frequent way, and kind of adapt to be adapted over time, probably more frequently than kind of what we're used to in the library and cultural heritage spaces, a 5-year strategic plan, for instance, or whatnot. Christine, do you want to add more to that?
I mean, I would say more often than not, it is some form of document, at least as a backup. We have seen a couple of places that have done sort of videos for their digital strategy explaining what they want to accomplish, and that's, I think those are fun. It entirely depends on who your audience is, and you might want to have several different outputs for different audiences. So we've done detailed digital strategies with organizations, but then a sort of one-pager that's the kind of thing you'll share with the vice chancellor, or whoever it is who's not going to read a 27-page digital detailed action plan and all of that. So it really depends on who the audience is in some ways.
We've also worked with organizations to kind of develop sort of digital strategy, and then had what I'll call a sidecar to that, which is digital principles, to sort of guide decision making and conversations as well.
Yeah, I can see how that kind of sort of principles piece could be really quite helpful, because again, there are so many things that do fall under that sort of digital and where you might be able to go. So just different elements that can help you narrow down where you need to focus on and how you make those decisions within some of the other elements that you mentioned. One of the things someone was finally asking was around about, the model that you sort of showed us, is it as relevant in a more horizontally structured organization? My suspicion is it would work, but I thought I'd ask the experts. What is your thought on that one?
Squish the pyramid. Yes. Say yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think we tried to design this model thinking about a range of organizations, and I would say, our work has ranged. I think in the last couple of years, we've been working with very large, very heavily decentralized organizations, and where really there are only carrots, there are no sticks, because the organization is so decentralized, there is nothing you can do. And so I think the actual sort of final inflection, as we said, it's going to depend on getting to know and the character of the organization before trying to change it. But the principles are still the same. It's still thinking about, what is the kind of culture at your existing organization, and where is that a sticking point for digital transformation? So the points are, I would say the sort of the overall structure and the thinking points are the same, but the way it is inflected, the way it's instantiated may be different depending on the organization.
Yeah, leadership could, leadership can fall to any individual in the organization. It doesn't have to be a sort of top-down